Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 10th annual Theodore H White Lecture on Press and Politics. I'm very pleased to see in the audience Walter Shorenstein, who is essentially the founder of the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press and Politics, and Marvin Kalb, its first director, who has returned from Washington with us tonight. I should point out that Marvin was just honored last night with the Lewis and Evelyn Smith First Amendment Award from Northeastern University in the Ford Hall Forum, and I was intrigued by the title of Marvin's acceptance speech, which is Freedom of the Press, much too radical a proposition for the timid of today. That's our Marvin. Welcome back to both of you. The Theodore White Lecture commemorates the life and career of one of America's great journalists. Teddy White created the style and set the standard for contemporary political journalism and campaign coverage. He studied Chinese history and East Asian languages as an undergraduate at Harvard in the 1930s and planned a career as a scholar. In fact, he was on that plan when he witnessed the 1939 bombing of Chongqing, and that turned him to a career of journalism. During World War II, he reported on East Asia for Time magazine, and over the next 2 decades established a solid career as reporter and commentator. But it was his coverage of the 1960 political campaign, particularly the making of the president in 1960, that changed the course of American political journalism with the depth and breadth of its perspective. And before his death, Theodore White also served here at the Kennedy School on our visiting committee and was one of the early architects of what would become the Shorenstein Center. Past Theodore White lectures have included such illustrious figures as William Safire, William Buckley, Cokie Roberts, Walter Cronkite, Jesse Jackson. And it's in that same vein that we're proud to have as a lecturer this year Garry Wills, who is one of America's foremost public intellectuals, who will be speaking on a subject that's of particular interest to us at the Kennedy School, American distrust of government. As many of you may know, we have a project here at the school which we call Visions of Governance for the 21st Century, which has been looking at the causes of distrust in government and what will have to be done about it if government is to change. In fact, we published a book on this subject which is called Why People Don't Trust Government. To introduce Mr. Wills, I'd like to present Professor Tom Patterson, the Bradley Professor of Government and Press and acting director of the Shorenstein Center in Press Politics and Public Policy. Tom is one of the leading scholars in his field. One of his works, The Unseeing Eye, is regarded as one of the 50 most influential books on public opinion in the past half century. And his recent book on the media's political role, Out of Order, received widespread attention from politicians, journalists, and scholars. We're delighted to have him as one of our members here at the Kennedy School and delighted to have him running the Shorenstein Center. Let me turn now to Tom Patterson. Tom?
Thank you, Joe. The Dean mentioned that I'm the Shorenstein Center's acting director. In case there's any confusion about that title, that's acting director as in interim director and not acting director of the type represented by Warren Beatty last night. This lecture series honors one of America's foremost writers and journalists, Teddy White. But it's also a tribute to Marvin Kalb, the founding director of the Shorenstein Center. The Theodore H White Lecture was Marvin's idea, and Marvin presided over this event for a decade, starting with Walter Cronkite's lecture in 1990. The series is also indebted to Blair Clark, Marvin's colleague and boss at CBS News. Blair is a charter member of the Shorenstein Center Advisory Board, and he raised the funds to make this lecture an annual event. Finally, we are here, as Dean Nye mentioned, because of Walter Shorenstein's unstinting support. He established the Shorenstein Center in loving memory of his daughter, Joan. She was a hugely talented news professional who worked with Blair and Marvin at CBS. Walter, Blair, Marvin, a warm welcome. I'd be grateful if you could just stand briefly so that we can acknowledge your contributions to this event. The Dean has stolen many of the things that I wanted to say about Teddy White, but you know, as the Dean mentioned, it was a captivating book on the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon campaign that made Teddy White a famous American. No writer had shown us the inner workings of a presidential campaign, and we marveled at it. The Making of the President, 1960, sold more than 2 million copies in its first year of publication. It was followed by best-selling books of the 1964, 68, and 72 campaigns, but White by then was getting tired. The candidate's hectic pace was also his pace. But unlike the candidates, well, except for Harold Stassen perhaps, he had to run in every race. He was also more than a bit discouraged by the impact of his books on election coverage. He had not dreamed that his behind-the-scenes portrayal would become the model of everyday election news, but it had. Strategy, personality, and horse race had trumped issues as the bedrock of campaign coverage. White was sitting in George McGovern's hotel room one day during the 72 campaign and was appalled by what he saw. He said to a colleague, "McGovern was like a fish in a goldfish bowl. There were 3 different network crews at different times. The still photographers kept coming in, groups of 5 at a time, and there were at least 6 different writers sitting in the corner. I don't even know their names. All of us are observing him, taking notes like mad, getting all the little details. I invented this method of reporting, and I now sincerely regret it. I truly regret it." White set out the 76 campaign, but returned in 80 to write a different kind of book. It had the obligatory behind-the-scenes accounts of the Reagan and Carter campaigns, but they were less than full. White's real purpose was to warn of the dangers of big money, big media, unbridled ambition, excessive partisanship, and disaffected voters. His book was entitled America in Search of Itself, and it stands today as a sad prophecy of what our presidential campaigns have become. We are fortunate tonight to have with us Teddy White's son, David. David, please stand so that we can express our thanks to you for coming and so that we can acknowledge and through you also acknowledge your father's many contributions to the field of press politics. I became aware of Gary Wills, like many others of my generation, when I went into a bookstore and purchased a copy of Nixon Agonistes. His book offered a revealing look at our politics, too revealing, judging by the response of the Nixon White House. It put Wills on its notorious enemies list. By the way, you're in pretty good company tonight. Marvin Kelb was on that list, and Dan Shore also, who's in the audience tonight, was on the list. A reviewer of Nixon Agonistes exclaimed that Wills had done the impossible. He had portrayed Nixon as, quote, a sympathetic, even tragic figure, while at the same time rendering him perfectly appalling. Nixon Agonistes was written before, not after Watergate, an event that led Wills to say, "Nixon is like a man who pulls off $1 million heist, only to get caught stealing an apple from a vendor's cart on the way out." Gary Wills got his start at William Buckley's National Review, but if Wills was ever a conservative, and he says no, the Vietnam War laid that issue to rest. He broke with Buckley over Vietnam and was twice arrested for protesting against the war. Did that make Wills a liberal? Again, he said no, and has often said that political labeling is a waste of time. But there is a different kind of label that we can attach to Wills. He is about as close as we have to a true Renaissance man. Who but Wills, among contemporary writers, could write thoughtful and elegant books about Richard Nixon and St. Augustine, about Abraham Lincoln and John Wayne, about Ronald Reagan and William Shakespeare? Who but Wills could write brilliant books with such far-ranging titles as The Second Civil War, Roman Culture, The Politics of Celebrity, and Witches and Jesuits? In case you're wondering, the last one is about Macbeth. I suspect, if he put his mind to it, that Garry Wills is the only writer in America who could tell us something new and that we might be tempted to read about Monica Lewinsky. How has Wills managed to write so intelligently about so many things? How do you become, as some have called him, America's foremost cultural historian? An answer comes through a question posed to him by a recent interviewer. What would a job applicant trying to fill your shoes choose as his or her title? Wills answered, a student of all kinds of things. That's why I insist on student. I can't imagine limiting myself to one thing. Everything leads to everything else. Their interaction is what's so fascinating. It's Wills' ability to see interactions that enabled him to take a solemn 272-word speech, the Gettysburg Address, and turn it into a lively 317-page Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Lincoln at Gettysburg. In addition to the Pulitzer, Wills has received 2 National Book Center Circle Awards and a Peabody Award. He has a PhD in classics from Yale and has written roughly 20 books. He is an adjunct professor of history at Northwestern University, a twice-a-week syndicated columnist, and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and other periodicals. And tonight, thankfully, he's with us. His talk has the same title as his most recent book, A Necessary Evil. No, it's not about Dr. Evil. I suspect that the cultural historian, that is Garry Wills, could tell us a thing or two about why Austin Powers and Dr. Evil have become pop icons, but that's not why he's here tonight. When Wills talks about a necessary evil, he is talking about Americans' chronic distrust of government. That distrust is an important part of our political culture, and it affects directly or indirectly nearly everything we do here at the Kennedy School. Professor Wills, the lectern is yours. A very warm welcome from the Kennedy School.
Thank you. I'm honored to be in this distinguished place and this distinguished company. I'm happy to see some friends out there, and even my former governor, who was my gracious host in the Illinois State Governor's Mansion for one night. And I'm especially honored to be associated with the name of Theodore White. He did that rare thing for a journalist. He expanded the repertory of reportage. He gave us a whole new area to write about, and I don't share his regrets about that, the result of that. We hear now that there's too much backstage reporting. It seems to me there's often too little. For instance, the campaign began very early, the last presidential campaign, when Dick Morris was pressing Clinton to raise lots of money to run very early ads. The more we knew about that, the better. Eventually we found out, but we would have been less surprised at the finance scandals if we had known that even earlier. As I say, it did come out, and one of the things that politicians should learn is what might be called the Theodore White rule. Namely, anything that your staff does is going to come out. Al Gore has not learned that. His Naomi Wolf episode proves that. He actually thought he could hide her. That's not been her talent so far. Just this afternoon at the hotel here, the New York Times called and asked me to do an op-ed piece on what this tells us about Al Gore's character. Well, I don't know what I'll say about that, but it tells us something about his intelligence. I mean, especially when you learn that she got into the act through Dick Morris. You know, here's the evil genius of the administration he's trying to distance himself from, and he takes Dick Morris's protege. I'm perfectly willing to think that he's very different from his boss, but he's certainly trying hard to erase the difference at the moment. As I think about what Teddy White did, this adding something new, I wonder if there's something new that can still be added to our reportage, and I wonder if it's not a kind of educational function that the press could perform in terms of explaining the Constitution every now and then. An example arose last January when Congress, upset at the many sins of President Clinton, decided we'll show him, we'll take away one of his privileges. We won't let him deliver the State of the Union address. Now that was a very odd motion. It never went far, but the mere idea that the State of the Union address is a kind of presidential prerogative is so at odds with what the Constitution says. It says that he has to report to Congress. Subordinates report to their superiors. And we know that this was an accountability measure because it says he must report from time to time, which doesn't mean occasionally. It's an 18th century term of art. It means without leaving anything out. You pick up where the last one ended. And that it occurs 3 times in the Constitution, and it always has to do with the duty of reporting. Congress has to give a report on the public monies from time to time. It has to publish its journals from time to time. It has to be accountable to the people, and the president has to be accountable to the Congress. The early State of the Union addresses showed that very clearly. They were very deferential. They said, there are these problems out there, and your job is to address them. All I can do is draw your attention to them. And we know that's what the Constitution intended, because the first State of the Union address by George Washington was written by James Madison, who knew something about the Constitution. But we should also remember that he was not a stickler for separation of the branches, because he not only wrote that State of the Union address, he then wrote Congress's response to it, and then he wrote the president's response to the response. Anyway, it seems like that would have been a nice opportunity for the press to point out some oddities of the Constitution that were not being paid attention to. There are others. Now, one time that happened, so it shows that it can occur. When Al Haig, after the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, said, "I'm in charge here, according to the Constitution," everybody said, "No, he's not," and that was useful. On the other hand, when he was going down a long list of people trying to get Archibald Cox fired, and nobody wanted to do it, he said, "Your commander-in-chief has given you an order." And I don't remember anybody pointing out that the president is not the commander-in-chief of any civilian in the United States. The Constitution makes it very clear that he's the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militias of the several states when actually called into service of the United States. That's all he's commander-in-chief, but we hear it all the time that the president is our commander-in-chief. It would be useful occasionally to point out that that's not the case. When the War Powers Act was proposed, some people said, this is unconstitutional, it's taking away some of the president's powers. It would have been useful to point out that it was unconstitutional because it was reclaiming only part of the powers that belong in their plenitude to Congress. Nobody else is allowed to make war except the Congress of the United States, according to the Constitution. I believe Tony Lewis pointed that out at the time, and probably some of you others did, but not enough of us did. Now, all 3 of those cases were ones in which we assume things about our president that the Constitution gives us no warrant to assume. And as I say, it's not a partisan act for journalists to point out occasionally that these are not covered by the Constitution. If we don't do that, then a thing creeps up called the Imperial Presidency. What's interesting about the Imperial Presidency is that, in a way, that was a growth in power in government that came about because we wanted a weak government. That is, we tended to inflate the power of the president under the Constitution because we thought he was supposed to be powerful enough to check the Congress. We thought that we have three branches that were supposed to be co-equal. And if the president was a subordinate reporting to his superiors, that wouldn't be quite co-equal. Well, it's also useful to point out that there is no such thing in the Constitution as equal branches. There's not even co-equal. You know, I just love that word. It's equaler than equal. Boy, it's really equal. But that goes along with our whole view that the Constitution was somehow supposed to check itself into immobility, that it was supposed to be inefficient. Two Supreme Court decisions, at least, have been based on the doctrine that the government was set up to be inefficient. It's not supposed to work very well, and that's the only thing that makes it good. It's a self-limiting, self-distrusting, self-checking government. You know, it's as if we went in to buy a car and we say, I want a really good car now. Don't foist anything off on me that's not a good car. Put down in writing that it's guaranteed to break down. Then I'll know it's good. That's what we say about our government. How did we ever get the idea that the government was supposed to be inefficient? The articles which it replaced were very inefficient. If that's what we wanted, we were there. There's no reason to leave it. And what does the Constitution say at the outset? We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union. Now, what does perfect mean there? Just dreamy, wonderful, as nice as can be? No, it's a technical term. Aristotle said that the perfect teleia constitution is one that has all the parts it needs to perform a job. The Greek gynecologist Soranus said what your doctor tells you when you get a baby. It's a perfect baby. It's got all its parts, right number of toes, ears, fingers, all those things. Now, the articles were imperfect. They didn't have all the parts. Why? There was such distrust of government in the articles that only one branch was allowed to exist, and that branch was under the control of the constituents who instructed their delegate, sent him only for 1 year, demanded open sessions so that they could see that the instructions were being followed, and could recall the delegate if the instructions were broken. Now, that's the kind of control they wanted, and they said if we have an executive that's representing not only separate locales, but the entirety, who's going to recall the executive when he gets out of hand? So we just won't have an executive. Same with the judiciary. We won't have a judiciary. We'll only have one branch. The result was a disaster. Jefferson said, we spend so much time on administrative details that we get no chance to pass laws. And he said, we need a more perfect government. Use the term perfect. Madison said, we spend all of our time doing things like supplying the army, setting up cumbrous adjudication procedures to judge between the claims of the states out in the Western Territory because we don't have a judiciary. And we're not allowed to have a judiciary that sets up a body of law, standards that everybody knows about, that are adhered to, which have some predictability. So the first job was to set up different branches, not for inefficiency, not to check each other, but to be efficient, to have different tasks. Even the bicameral check within the legislature was explained by Madison in terms of efficient function. He said that the Senate has a higher age requirement, longer terms, staggered terms, because it's supposed to be the institutional memory of the government. When a treaty is drawn up, another country with the United States, they want to know that the government's going to be around for a while, that it's not going to all go out of existence in 2 years, as the House does. And that's why the Senate is given diplomatic duties. It's the one to approve ambassadors. It's the one to ratify treaties. It's the one in conjunction with the House to declare war. The House, by contrast, was supposed to be more sensitive to domestic needs. Money was its sphere, and therefore everybody goes out every 2 years, unlike the Senate. So it's function that defines these things, not simply checking and balancing. And they're not equal. The branches are not equal. The Congress can set up the executive branch. It establishes the agencies. It can take them away. It sets up the federal court system. It establishes the number on the Supreme Court. It can change that. It's been 6, it's been 7, it's been 9. It can be anything that Congress wants it to be. And if the judiciary and the executive are not performing the way the legislature wants, if it's not executing the laws that it's passed, it's not judging properly, they can investigate and impeach and convict and dismiss any member of the executive branch, any member of the judiciary, federal judiciary. There's no reciprocal power of the president or the court to investigate Congress, to restructure Congress, to dismiss members of Congress. So the idea that there's a kind of equality is, on the face of it, absurd. How can there be an equality when the making of law precedes in dignity as well as time the application of the law, and the most direct representation is in the lawmaking body, so that Madison said in Federalist 51, in a Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. Well, isn't it true that the president can veto a law, say, or that the Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional? Well, that's true. They can do that. But what's the logic of the veto, for instance? It's a bad idea to have the executive disagreeing with the law that he is executing, and he can often have legitimate complaints. He can say, for instance, you've given me a law to execute, but you haven't given me the means to execute it. Or it's in contradiction with something else that you've given me in law. Or it goes against what I believe and people who are important to this nation believe. So you better reconsider this, which is what he says, of course. He doesn't kill the law at that point. He has no power to do that. He sends it back. And the Congress, again, because you don't want a grudging executive if you can avoid it, says, all right, we will reconsider and we'll decide, and if we really think this is what the law should be, we'll send it back to you, this time with a 2/3 majority, and then you have to execute it. You have no choice. No matter how you hate it, how you dislike it, it's your job under the Constitution to execute it, and you have no further recourse. Ours is the last word. And the judicial review is similar in rationale to a veto. The court says, wait a minute, you just passed a law that goes against the fundamental law, the Constitution, that gives you lawmaking authority. You better reconsider it, because they also are in effect throwing it back to the Congress, and at this point they've exhausted their entire store of ammunition. The Congress, by contrast, has a whole range of options it can turn to. It can say, no, it's not really against the Constitution, you've misunderstood, and we'll phrase it in such a way as to make clear that it's not against the Constitution. Or they can say, well, yeah, it is against the Constitution, but it should be in the Constitution, so we begin the amendment process and we'll put it in. Or they can say, you are so wrong about the Constitution that you're not fulfilling your obligations under the Constitution, and we impeach you. Or they can say, we think this court is totally misunderstanding the Constitution, and the court is our responsibility, and therefore we are going to add 3 more justices and see what they think. In all those cases, the court has no recourse. Once again, what Congress says is the final word. So the idea of an equality between the branches has no basis in fact, and every time you hear co-equal being used, it should make you feel the hairs on your head stand up a little, and you might mention that occasionally. Well, but advocates of weak government say, it's not simply that the branches within government, the departments, as Madison called them, are supposed to check each other, stop each other dead in their tracks. We also have states that are sovereign, so they can be a check on the federal government. My first memories of political national convention are probably similar to yours, I can remember on the radio hearing the sovereign state of such and such delivers its so many votes to so-and-so with giddy delight. It was great to roll that phrase out, sovereign states. Richard B. Morris, in a very devastating long article, established that the original states were never sovereign. Never at any time did they have the attributes of sovereignty. Never at any time did they have an independent foreign policy. Did they have a navy, an army, a post office, a mint, any of the things that you associate with a sovereign government. What happened? The states, the colonies as they were becoming states, sent representatives to Philadelphia and said, if the other states withdraw, vote with them to withdraw with them as the United States. And that was what declared independence, the United States of America. Oaths of allegiance were taken to the United States of America. When Benedict Arnold and others were accused of treason, it was not treason to their states, it was treason to the United States of America. So the sovereign power was the United States of America from the very minute the United States came into existence at all, and from the very minute that the states were detached from the British Empire. Now there's one severe problem with that Richard Morris article. He doesn't go into it, but it's kind of obvious. The Articles of Confederation begin by saying this is a compact between sovereign states. How do you get around that? Well, that's a very interesting clause. It was put in by Thomas Burke of North Carolina. And he put it in, without a lot of support, by the way, in order to kill the rest of the document. And when it failed to do that, he went back to North Carolina and he said, do not ratify the Articles, because they say you're a sovereign, and then they say you're not. You are not allowed to have an army or a navy or independent foreign policy. If 9 states say you have to go to war, even if you're among the 3 that don't want to, you have to do it, the 3 or 4. And none of the attributes of sovereignty are preserved to you under the Articles of Confederation. So, Thomas Burke, the man who should know best, says that in the Articles of Confederation, that phrase means absolutely nothing. Now, why do we want to have a weak government? I suppose one of the reasons is that we think a weak government will be unable to oppress us. That's not a very realistic approach. The Soviet Union, we now realize, was a very weak government, had a very surface hold on its population. Did that make it less tyrannical or more? Weak governments are not necessarily just ones, limited ones. Even in your own experience, if you know anybody in authority, if he or she is weak, does that make them more likely to be confident, fair, just, or more likely to be panicky, arbitrary, random? Keeping government weak is no way to keep government just. And the idea that government should be weak, the idea that we should fear government, that government is of itself semi-illegitimate from its birth, that it even proclaims its own hatred of itself by trying to check itself all the time, leads to very bad results. For instance, every advanced country in the world wonders about American politics in certain areas. It wonders, for instance, why we love guns so much, that we tolerate far the highest murder rate of any civilized country. They wonder why other countries can have comprehensive health care plans for their citizens, and this, the richest country in the world, can't. Why other countries can control campaign conditions, including campaign financing, and we can't. Why other countries have educational policies that have a national standard that everybody has to live up to so that all people can be educated, all the citizens, under a just arrangement. They wonder why we fear authority so much that not only our own federal government is supposed to be kept weak, but that we fear tyranny by others, by the world order, the New World Order, or the UN, or somebody, which means that we can't sign the Law of the Seas Treaty, the Landmine Treaty, the protocols of the World Court, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, why we have to starve the United Nations for funds that we owe them, again, though we are the most wealthy nation in the world. Why is this? Because in all those cases, all you have to say is the government is coming, the government is coming, and people will be scared out of their senses. If the government can take away your guns, you have no freedoms left. If the government can tell you what to do about health, doctors and patients will lose all right to choose the proper treatments and the proper relationship between them. If the government sets standards for education, it will dictate a government orthodoxy which will kill freedom of thought. None of that's happened in other nations that do this. Why do we think that it has to happen in our nation? One of the problems, of course, if you think the government is bad of itself, that government is something that you should have the least of, and the best government, as Thoreau said, is no government. What's the proper response to that? If it's so bad, you can't really make it good. You can't decide that it has proper functions and restrict it to those. There are several reactions that seem to come to mind. You say, well, government's government, you can't do anything about it, so apathy and lethargy are the only response. Or you can say it's always bad, so we'll resist it always by any means we can, which includes guns in the case of militias. This pessimism about government is not a healthy way of controlling government, of finding out what is its proper task and keeping it out of improper tasks. And that's another thing. We're often told that the Constitution was established by people who had a very pessimistic view of human nature, a dark view, and didn't trust each other, didn't trust fellow citizens, didn't trust the government, didn't trust our own agents that we had elected to send there. Well, that's true that there is a lot of that language, that pessimistic language, but it's not voiced by the advocates of the Constitution. It's voiced by their enemies, by the AntiFederalists. Those are the ones who said we can't trust government. Government's always bad. We can't accept this Constitution because it's government and therefore it's bad. Madison, when he came up against this in the ratifying debate in Virginia, Patrick Henry was very eloquently saying, this is an instrument of tyranny, this Constitution, had this to say: I go on the great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. If there be sufficient virtue and intelligence in the community, it will be exercised in the selection of these men so that we do not depend on their virtue or put confidence in rules, but in the people who are chosen to represent them. Now, is that too optimistic? Is that too sappy? After all, we've lived with a language of cynicism about our government. It's full of bureaucrats and hacks and politicians who are self-seeking and corruption and all of that. Is there no virtue, as Madison asked? I think there is. As a matter of fact, the people who talk about the government as the enemy remind me of the governors in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, when I and many of you were covering that. It was the outsider who came in to the South in that period and violated the Ronald Reagan rule that the local people know best their own needs, their own wants, what's appropriate to them, not foreign federal people. Well, what the local people knew best about their blacks at the time was that they needed beating and hosing and being bitten by dogs and being sent to jail and being killed. And the foreign power that came to those people as a rescuer, as a defender of their rights as American citizens. And that was exactly what the Constitution was meant to do. As you can see by looking at the number in the Federalist that was written by John Jay about Indian affairs. He said, we as a people, under the Articles, have waged unjust wars against Indians because the people who made decisions about how to react to crises were those who were living in friction at the borders with the Indians, where passions were inflamed on both sides, where retaliatory vengeance was something that blinded people to other considerations. If we have a federal government with the power to go to those situations and take a cooler, more impersonal look at the matter, it can impose a just solution. Well, that's what happened in the Civil Rights Movement, and that's what's happened over and over in our history, so that the most interesting thing I think about this country at the end of this century is that over the last 2 or 3 decades, we have had more active, effective concern for individual dignity and rights than ever in our history, or than any other country in history that I know of. We have had a totally new way of looking at the rights of women, half the human race, of blacks and other minorities, of gays, of the disabled, and in almost all of those cases, federal action, debate, courts, laws, has played some role, fulfilling exactly the role that John Jay wanted it to fulfill, and going to the defense of the defenseless all around the nation. Now that's the kind of government we need, and the kind of government we need to control, but also the kind of government we need to respect. Thank you.
Gary Wells, thank you. That was a thoughtful and beautifully expressed talk. We'll now take questions from the audience. There are microphones positioned along in the aisles here. I think there are also 2 up on the second level. And we ask of questioners only that they ask a question and not engage in speech making. Let me ask the first question, take the moderators, or exercise the moderator's privilege here. You suggested that the press may have a role to play in helping us to better understand the Constitution, to sort of drop, for example, references to co-equal branches of government. But, you know, one might argue that the notion of the press as a 4th branch, which has no clear constitutional basis as far as I know, really leads to kind of an elevated notion of the press as a watchdog, really feeds out of and comes out of that same kind of political culture that you're talking about, and in fact maybe an influence that puts more distance rather than less distance between the government and the public. Do you have a response to that?
Sure, the press should not be partisan in saying, oh, so-and-so said something wrong about the Constitution. But you know, these are nonpartisan issues. Saying that we don't have co-equal branches is not really a Republican position or a Democratic position, it's the Constitution. And there's no thing that says that an American citizen can't say that the Constitution doesn't say that. You know, when people say to me, how do you overcome the distrust of government? It's always hard to change a culture. But one of the things that you should do is perhaps not have academicians who do this also, or journalists who just parrot thoughtless phrases like co-equal. They indurate the prejudice, the ignorance. And if you are going to say, well, I'm not a teacher, I'm not telling the people what they should think, therefore I can't say that calling the branches co-equal is nonsense. That seems to me putting inhibitions on the press that are unneeded. And also making it impossible to break through, not only with the press, but other people, these bad habits we've fallen into, like calling our president the commander-in-chief.
Thank you for your speech. My name is Maddie Germer. I'm a freshman here at Harvard College. And the question I have for you deals with partisanship in American politics. And it seems to me that especially in my generation, a lot of the distrust that people have for government is for the two political parties because they see them as machines and not representing their interests. And so my question for you is, do you think that partisan politics detracts from government, or do you think it's an important role that helps check each other in the Congress?
Well, partisanship always exists and always will. Even when there weren't parties, partisanship existed. It exists in all the other countries in the world. That's one aspect of resentment of this government, of this administration. But as I say, ours is qualitatively different from that. You have partisan animosities in every country you can think of. But they don't have that kind of inhibition that we have about never letting the government say anything about guns or health or education or any of those other things. So underneath the partisan bickering, there is this solid ground of distrust of government, widely shared, by the way, by both parties. The distrust of government is so great and is expressed so that, for instance, the Clinton health plan, which deserved to fail on several grounds, was crippled from the outset because there was such fear of the old cry of socialized medicine and government doing it that they had to go out of the way to jerry-rig it so that say, oh, no, it's not all government. There's this private sector, there's this insurance component, there's this and that and the other thing, so that the accountability got very complicated. You couldn't just say, well, why don't we have a plan like Canada, a single-player plan? Because then socialized medicine, the issue would be dead. So I'm talking about a qualitatively different kind of distrust of government than mere partisanship.
I'm Jay Siegel, member of the faculty here at the Kennedy School. You seem to suggest that at bottom you would place your faith in the will of the people, generally, to keep the government on a sound course. Walter Lippmann, on the other hand, long held to the view that in order to get decisions from the government that were beneficial for the people, an elitist class was necessary to be created, supported, and continued to control the government mechanism. Would you care to comment on Lippmann's viewpoint?
Yes. The Phantom Public in 1929 by Walter Lippmann followed what was a very urgent trend at the time. They were scared to death of technology in the 1920s, this is. So that the Linds, when they wrote their book about Muncie, Indiana, said that the number of things that a housewife has to keep track of now are just beyond her. She can't choose the right implements. She doesn't know what's a good vacuum cleaner. She doesn't know the new marketing ploys, so we're going to have experts to tell her how to shop. Well, shortly after that, along came Lippmann and said, well, if you can't buy a refrigerator without expertise, how are we going to buy a foreign policy? It's beyond the ordinary person. Therefore, we need these boards of experts who will set policy, and the people will just ratify. Now, it's interesting that we're hearing the same kind of thing today about a good deal of our technology. They're saying, oh, the internet is so complicated that the underclass will never be able to take part in it. One of the things that's wrong about that is that in order to sell this stuff, refrigerators and the internet and even foreign policy, you have to make it user-friendly. You have to explain it to people. And technology has done that in wonderful ways. Cars were very difficult to run at the outset. You practically had to be an engineer, and then they got everything, self-starters, self-steerers, self-brakers, self-windows going up and down. The same thing's happening with computers, by the way. They're getting idiot-friendly. So I think that Lippmann's book is a historical curiosity, but it's not really a serious position we should entertain.
Nathan Glazer. I've noticed recently on the right a few figures who are speaking about the need for a stronger national government. The name of young William Crystal and David Brooks and Donald Kagan and so on, trying to exalt Theodore Roosevelt and saying, we on the right have been too distrustful of government. We need more government. What do you think of this trend? Is it parallel to what you are saying, or does it come from different sources and aiming at different ends?
I find it quite comforting. I think the reason is that Newt Gingrich and others drove the anti-government position into such disrepute that these people are trying to recoil in some measure. William Bennett is another one. And they're appealing not so much to Theodore Roosevelt, though they do that too, but to Hamilton. Hamilton's having a great comeback even among Republicans and also among Democrats. It's one of the most interesting things that's going on right now. You know, there's a seesaw in our history. When Jefferson's down, Hamilton's up. And Jefferson's down now. Yeah, I think that's very encouraging, and I was more encouraged when George W. Bush said in New York that our party has been too ready to say that government is just the problem and not the solution. That was a pretty brave renunciation of the Ronald Reagan maxim. We always have this problem, of course, that you can't go too far saying government is terrible because you want to get into it. And there's always something a little absurd about saying, I despise politicians. Everybody in the Beltway is a fool or a knave. The government itself is rotten, so please send me there. And of course, when they get sent there, they get accused of learning to like it too much. And then it's said that they lied to their people and said, I hated it. You're loving it. You're not hating it. So the cynicism keeps breeding. So politicians often do have to back off, sometimes blatantly, sometimes subtly. Having campaigned on term limits, they get in and decide that term limits don't really have such a good basis after all. That's something with a long, glorious tradition. The most anti-governmental of the founding fathers, of course, was Thomas Jefferson. He was out of the country when the Constitution was drawn up, and he thought that that was a fatal flaw in the document. But what he most attacked was the perpetual re-eligibility of the president. We should have only one-term presidents until Thomas Jefferson became president, and he served 2.
Thank you for coming, sir, up here.
Yeah.
When I spoke with leaders of the militias around the nation, they told me that they were concerned with governmental power, not because of partisanship or things like that, but because law enforcement was so strong. And so strong. They pointed to things like Waco, things like Ruby Ridge. How do you respond to that?
Well, Waco was a disaster, of course. I don't know if it was because of strength or weakness and panic and fear. But to say that police work is often inefficient and oppressive is not to say that, therefore, the solution is to do your own policing, become your own police force. It's to reform the police force, to reform the FBI, to reform the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, not to form militias. And it is a difficult question if people hold themselves up with guns and refuse to answer subpoenas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I suppose that one solution is to just wait them out for several years. They didn't come up with a better solution, but because the police beat Rodney King, does that mean that we must not reform the police, but form our own police? That's a very dangerous doctrine. For one thing, the police they form not only fight the police everybody else has, but if they fight them well enough, then we'll have to form our own police. Then we'll all have our own feuding gangs. So that seems to me not really a serious argument to say that because the police are wrong, we should make ourselves the police.
Felicity Spector, I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'm wondering whether you subscribe to the theory of American exceptionalism, if you like. Is this a peculiarly American disease, this dislike of government? We in Europe are somewhat more fond of our social institutions.
Yeah, well, in general, I subscribe to the idea that all nations are exceptional. None of them follow the same pattern, really. What's objected to with American exceptionalism, we are exceptional. We're different in all kinds of ways, good and bad. One of the most exceptional things about us was the separation of church and state. Hadn't been done before. Extremely exceptional. So radical that we're still find it hard to convince ourselves it means what it means. But we're doing better. What's normally objected to with American exceptionalism is to say that Americans are better than others, are more virtuous, are better able to do things, and so exceptional that we can't join with the UN, with international organizations, because they're not as good as we are. They don't understand virtue in the same sense that we do, which means we have to go our own way, and we can't cooperate with others. For instance, the people now who want to say, oh, well, we'll serve abroad, but we can't ever serve under the command of a UN officer, only under our own. Well, that means, of course, that the advantages we could get from cooperation with other people, we forswear if we stick to that. It's to our own advantage to learn to cooperate. After all, we're supposed to be the leader of the free world. Leaders have to engage their followers. They can't say, well, I'm too good for you to follow me. You just got to go find something else. So that's the problem with American exceptionalism in its common use. Graham Greene made great fun of it when he said in The Quiet American that the whole history of the 20th century has been one of decolonization, the creation of hundreds of new nations, the emergence of a third of the globe that was under domination from long distant countries. And Vietnam was one little chapter of that series. It was the French Indochinese colony breaking up. And we thought we could go in, and against all this tide of history, just go separate ourselves from that. This has nothing to do with decolonization or nationalism or anti-Europeanism or any of that. It's just us good guys teaching you good government. So Pyle, his character in The Quiet American, says, we're not like those countries. We come with clean hands. And that was the whole delusion of Vietnam. He said, it was a touching innocence. And he said, innocent people should wear bells like ancient lepers so people will know that there's danger coming.
I'm Sarah Hamlin. I'm a student at the Kennedy School, and my question would be, do you think Americans trust the internet or the government more, and what do you think in terms of preparation for Y2K? Are they willing to trust the government to help them through January 1st?
Oh, we'll all want lots of government help there. See, whenever there's an impending disaster, a hurricane or some kind of tidal wave or something like that, we all run for the government. Or when there's tainted meat abroad, then we suddenly say, oh my God, we don't want local people telling us that this meat's okay. And it's like when an airplane crashes, we don't say to the nearest airport, the local people understand their local needs best, so they should investigate this crash and find out what went wrong. No, we want federal people to do that. So the Y2K, I think people would be glad of any help from government. Do they trust the internet? The internet has so many different voices that they choose one voice and trust it, crazily or confidently and totally. It's like talk radio. People say talk radio will offer you all kinds of opinions, but people only listen to one, the one that they're already disposed to, so the pluralism doesn't seem to affect them much. I was just on a show with a woman in Pittsburgh, and it was only the second time I've been on a talk show with a woman, Mary Madeline being the other one. And I said, there aren't too many of you, and she said, no, I'm a woman, but even worse, I'm a liberal. There are even fewer of us in talk radio. So the internet offers this wonderful smorgasbord of things that you can choose, but most people are not going to shop on it. They're going to go honing into the thing they trust. It's the same way they dial in Rush Limbaugh.
There seems to be a push from the right towards a decentralization of government down to the states. do you believe that this is something that people are accepting, and why do you think people, if they do, would accept state authority more than they would federal authority? Because, I mean, theoretically, it seems that states might be more responsive to the needs of the public, but if you look at it another way, you could say that that's 50 governments you have to keep track of instead of just one.
That's right. Well, that's a continual tug of war, of course. The states have a different role, and they always were meant to have. As Madison said, we're not trying to get rid of the states. He said something, though, that they were not too happy about. He said, the states are to the federal government as the counties are to the states. They're administrative units. And his argument for them was efficiency again, division of labor. There's a lot that the federal government shouldn't do because it's just not efficient in doing it. So local people should do best what local people do best. But of course, this all gets tied in with this nutty idea that the states are somehow sovereign, that they're reclaiming their sovereignty, that they're acting out a partial sovereignty, which is a contradiction in terms. So that we have some justices and other people now trying to say that the 10th Amendment means that the states are reasserting their sovereignty. 10th Amendment doesn't say anything about sovereignty. It says powers not delegated to the federal government are not delegated to the federal government. It's tautological. Of course they're not. If they're not delegated, then they belong in the states. Justice Scalia, by the way, is on this, as on some other things, including the independent counsel law, very sensible. He's all for states' rights, but he says it's not in the 10th Amendment. It's in the structure of the document. The 10th Amendment has nothing to do with sovereignty.
Luc Lampriere, I'm a student here at the Kennedy School too. I was wondering a little bit on this phenomenon you describe as, and having its core as being very American. Same thing seems to be happening in other parts of the world, and I was wondering, is it because we are becoming more like you? I'm from France, for instance. Or is it because there is something new that's coming up that's adding to the thing you've described? Can you separate those two phenomena?
You're saying that distrust of government is happening in other countries too? Right. Which countries did you have in mind?
It's everywhere. I mean, in Europe, let's say, yes, there's a strong distrust in government. It doesn't mean that people would I mean, distrust in what the government is doing.
Well, yeah, there is distrust of government all the time, and should be. It's a healthy attitude to take toward anything powerful. It's the attitude we take toward others who have power over our lives. We should distrust doctors and lawyers and accountants, not because there's anything wrong with those, but because that's the way we keep them accountable. We say, explain to me why I have to do this. Explain to me why this surgery makes sense. Explain to me why I'm paying you this amount of money. In all of those ways, we are asserting our need for accountability. On the other hand, we don't want them to be amateurs. We want them to be professional, to know things we don't know. So when we're hiring an agent, there's a constant tension between accountability and trust in their expertise that we don't have. Now that applies everywhere and should apply everywhere. We have certain things that go beyond that, and other countries have certain things that go beyond that. Distrust of government in many countries around the world now is a function of ethnic tension, of different governmental components being assembled quite recently in time, of religious, fundamentalist, and other tensions. So that, as I said, every nation is exceptional, and you have to look at each one for the reasons for distrust of government. In Canada, for instance, the distrust between the English and the French-speaking segments is very strong. That's quite different from ours. So I don't think that there is a universal rule except the healthy human instinct for distrust of government, and I'm trying to single out what's specific about our situation.
One last question.
Hi, thanks. Carolyn Glick from the Kennedy School. I was just wondering, in terms of leadership, and American leadership in particular, President Clinton, in a few speeches that he's given this past couple of weeks, has been saying that one of the reasons why his plans aren't passing is because people in the Congress feel that the United States is so well off that they don't have to cooperate anymore between the branches. And I'm wondering, in terms of leadership and the capability of leadership to succeed in the United States, whether the United States has to be in trouble in order for Americans to delegate enough responsibility to their leaders to actually take on leadership challenges and succeed in them?
Good question. Leadership is easier in times of peril because people cry out for it and cling to it. So in war, it becomes almost dangerously easy, and we're willing to give up too much of our distrust of government. We become too docile. We allow the government to get away with things like imprisoning Japanese Americans. And it's quite true that our great presidents tend to be our war presidents, or presidents in times of crisis, depression, or whatever. I think President Clinton has a certain justification for that. On the other hand, one of the reasons he has trouble with leadership is that he destroyed his credibility as a leader so disastrously. Leadership is possible even in prosperous times, but it's difficult. It's much more difficult. I spoke to this group some years ago and used the analogy of sailing, that if you're up against a good wind, the boat responds instantly to the tiller. If you're in a dead calm, you just work it back and forth and nothing happens. Well, that can be the case with prosperity. On the other hand, a lot of our advances have been made in times of prosperity because we're willing to take chances. The 60s, for instance, was willing to do various things in terms of civil rights and women's rights, in the 70s more, and minority rights because we were prosperous, because we could take a chance. And something like that may be happening now in things like gay rights. It's very extraordinary progress in that at the moment, which might not have occurred when people are scared and quick to accuse each other of horrible things. So there's a different kind of leadership needed in times of prosperity, and we can often do things then that we could not do otherwise. So let's try to take advantage of that.
Gary Wells, thank you again for joining us tonight, and thank all of you for coming. If you'd like to be part of the continuing discussion of this topic, please join the two of us and Linda Wertheimer, David Gergen, Tom Edsel, Jenny Mansbridge tomorrow morning at 9:30 in the penthouse of this building for a 2-hour seminar on the same subject. Thank you very much for coming.
That was very thoughtful. One thought for you, though, is first, you don't, on this question about the foreigners.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
You have to answer the question, why has distrust in government increased, both in the United States and other countries in the last 30 years? And